No one believed a billionaire would ever return to the dirt road he once escaped. But the day Ethan Caldwell did, he found something no amount of money could explain. The black SUV rolled slowly along a narrow country road carved between tired wooden houses and fields that had long stopped producing much more than dust. The tires crunched softly over gravel as the vehicle passed rusted mailboxes and sagging fences that leaned like old men too stubborn to fall. Ethan Caldwell sat in the back seat, silent, his eyes fixed on the familiar landscape sliding past the window. 43 years old, worth more than $4 billion, owner of tech companies that lit up skyscrapers from New York to San Francisco. Yet the place tightening his chest right now was a forgotten village tucked deep in rural America, where the nearest real town sat nearly 30 miles away. He hadn't been here in 25 years, not since the day he'd left with a single backpack and a promise to never come back. The driver glanced in the mirror, unsure why a man who owned private jets wanted to crawl down a road that barely deserved to be called pavement. Ethan didn't explain. His eyes moved slowly from house to house, memories flickering behind them like old film reels, the grocery store that once let his mother buy food on credit. The crooked church steeple where winter coats were handed out every December. The empty basketball court where cracked asphalt still held faded white lines. The village looked smaller than he remembered, quieter too, like time had simply stopped visiting. A few people noticed the unfamiliar luxury vehicle and paused in their yards, confusion written across their faces. They had heard rumors that the boy who grew up poor here had become one of the richest men in America, but rumors rarely drove down their road in a glossy black SUV. Ethan slowly exhaled as the car approached the curve leading deeper into the village, unaware that within the next few minutes, something waiting on the side of that road would change the reason he came back forever. The SUV slowed even more as it entered the center of the small village, where a single general store stood beside an aging gas pump that had not been repainted in years. A few men sitting on wooden chairs outside the store stopped talking as the vehicle approached. Expensive cars did not come here, and certainly not ones that looked like they belonged on the streets of Manhattan. Ethan Caldwell watched them through the tinted glass, recognizing the slow rhythm of the place immediately. Nothing here ever rushed. A dog wandered lazily across the road. A pickup truck older than he was sat parked beside the store with dust covering its hood. One of the men leaned forward, squinting toward the SUV as if trying to place a memory that refused to come easily. Ethan felt the strange pull of familiarity tightening inside his chest. This was the road he used to walk every morning before the sun rose, sometimes in winter cold, so sharp it stung his lungs, just to help his mother open the diner that no longer existed. The building had been torn down years ago, replaced now by a patch of empty land, where tall grass swayed in the quiet breeze. The driver slowed almost to a crawl as more villagers began noticing the unusual visitor. A woman watering flowers paused mid-motion. Two teenagers stopped their bicycles and stared openly. The black SUV looked like a foreign object dropped into a place that had not changed since the 1990s. Ethan finally spoke softly from the back seat. "You can stop up ahead near the bend." The driver nodded and guided the vehicle forward another 50 yards until the narrow road curved gently beside a row of tall oak trees that cast wide shadows across the gravel. As the SUV rolled toward that quiet stretch of road, Ethan noticed something small sitting near the edge of the shoulder. At first it looked like a pile of worn blankets, but then the shape moved slightly. The driver eased his foot off the gas as Ethan leaned slightly forward, his eyes narrowing toward the small figure near the edge of the road. From a distance, it looked like nothing more than a bundle of faded clothing resting beside the gravel shoulder. But as the SUV rolled closer, the shape slowly became clear. It was a little girl sitting alone on the ground, with her knees pulled close to her chest. Her dress was pale blue but worn thin, the fabric wrinkled as if it had been washed too many times. In her arms, she held a small stuffed rabbit with one ear missing. The afternoon sun filtered through the tall oak trees above her, casting long shadows across the road, while a warm breeze stirred the dry grass around her feet. Ethan felt something tighten in his chest as the car came to a complete stop about 20 feet away. Children did not usually sit alone on empty country roads like this, especially not in a village where everyone knew everyone else. The driver looked back through the mirror with quiet confusion. "Do you want me to keep going, sir?" Ethan did not answer immediately. His eyes stayed fixed on the girl. She was not looking toward the car the way most children would when a vehicle stopped nearby. Instead, she faced slightly downward, her head tilted as if she were listening carefully to something in the distance. For several seconds, she did not move at all. Then slowly she lifted her face toward the sound of the idling engine. Ethan opened the door and stepped out of the SUV, the gravel crunching beneath his polished shoes. The girl reacted to the sound, immediately turning her head slightly in his direction, but not quite meeting his eyes. That was the moment Ethan noticed something unusual. Her gaze did not focus on him. Her eyes were open, calm, almost searching, yet they seemed to look somewhere beyond the world in front of her. And suddenly Ethan understood something that made his heart sink quietly in his chest. The quiet road seemed to hold its breath as Ethan Caldwell stood beside the open door of the SUV, staring at the little girl sitting alone near the gravel shoulder. Up close, she looked even smaller than he first thought, no more than 8 or 9 years old, with pale skin and light brown hair that had fallen loosely around her shoulders. Her shoes were dusty, the kind children wear every day because there is no other pair waiting at home. She held the worn, stuffed rabbit tightly against her chest, as if it were the only thing in the world that still belonged to her. Ethan took a slow step forward, and the gravel shifted beneath his shoe. Immediately, the girl turned her head toward the sound. Her face lifted slightly, searching the air in front of her. "Hello there," Ethan said gently, keeping his voice calm and warm the way people speak when they do not want to frighten a child. The girl did not answer right away, but her fingers tightened around the rabbit. "Are you waiting for someone?" he asked. For a moment, the breeze moved softly through the oak branches above them, carrying the distant creak of a screen door somewhere down the road. Then the girl spoke in a small, careful voice. "I am waiting for my mom and dad." Ethan felt a faint ache behind those words. He glanced briefly down the road, which stretched empty for nearly a quarter mile in both directions. There were no cars approaching, no footsteps, no voices. "How long have you been sitting here?" he asked. The girl tilted her head again, listening to where his voice came from, rather than looking directly at him. "I am not sure," she said quietly. "They told me to stay right here and wait." Ethan knelt slowly so he was closer to her height. The moment he lowered himself, he noticed again that her eyes never quite focused on his face. They drifted just slightly past him, calm but distant, as though the world she saw existed somewhere else entirely. And as the truth settled deeper into his mind, Ethan realized the girl sitting alone on that road was not simply waiting. She could not see anything at all. The realization settled quietly over Ethan Caldwell as he knelt beside the little girl, the soft wind brushing across the dusty road while the oak branches above them swayed slowly in the afternoon light. Her eyes were open and calm, but they did not lock onto anything around her. Instead, they seemed to drift gently beyond the world in front of her, as if she were listening more than seeing. Ethan kept his voice soft and steady. "What is your name, sweetheart?" The girl hugged the worn, stuffed rabbit closer to her chest before answering. "My name is Lily Harper." Her voice was careful, polite, the way children speak when they are trying to be brave, even though they are unsure about the world around them. "That is a nice name," Ethan replied quietly. "My name is Ethan." Lily turned her head slightly toward the sound of his voice again, her small brow tightening in concentration, as though she was mapping his position through the air. "Are you standing right in front of me?" she asked. Ethan nodded even though she could not see the motion. Yes, I am right here. For a moment, neither of them spoke. A truck rumbled faintly somewhere far down the highway several miles away, the sound barely reaching the quiet village road. Ethan glanced once more along the empty stretch of gravel that curved between the trees. There was still no sign of anyone returning. Lily shifted slightly on the ground and brushed dust from her dress with careful movements. My mom said they would come back soon, she said. Ethan felt the quiet weight in those words. Did they leave a little while ago? He asked gently. Lily thought about the question for several seconds. I think it has been a long time, she answered softly. The sun feels warmer now. Ethan looked up at the sky. The afternoon had already begun leaning toward early evening. The shadows from the oak trees stretched nearly 15 feet across the road. Something about that detail made his chest tighten again. Lily slowly tilted her face toward him once more. Mr. Ethan, she said carefully. Are you a good person? The question hung gently in the warm afternoon air, simple yet unexpectedly heavy. Mr. Ethan, are you a good person? Ethan Caldwell did not answer right away. He remained kneeling on the gravel road in front of Lily Harper, studying the quiet expression on her face as she waited patiently. Her small hands continued holding the worn stuffed rabbit as if it were the most reliable thing she had left in the world. For a man who negotiated billion-dollar contracts and commanded boardrooms filled with executives, the question from a little girl sitting beside a rural road felt strangely difficult. Ethan slowly let out a breath and spoke carefully. I try to be. Lily nodded slightly, as if the answer made sense to her. My mom says good people have calm voices, she said softly. Ethan almost smiled at that. The breeze shifted through the oak trees again, and a few dry leaves slid across the gravel. Behind him, the driver remained inside the SUV, watching quietly, but saying nothing. Ethan glanced once more down the road in both directions. The village remained peaceful and slow, but still no one was coming for Lily. Do you know where your home is? Ethan asked gently. Lily tilted her head again as if thinking about the question through sound rather than sight. It is somewhere near the church, I think, she said after a moment. The one with the bell that rings on Sundays. Ethan knew exactly which church she meant. The white wooden building stood about half a mile from where they were sitting, its tall steeple visible from nearly anywhere in the village. That is not very far, he said reassuringly. Lily seemed to relax slightly when she heard that. She brushed her fingers along the stuffed rabbit again and spoke quietly. My dad said we had to stop here for a minute. Then he said they would come back. Ethan felt something uneasy settle deeper in his chest. How long ago was that, Lily? She lifted her face toward the warmth of the sun again, thinking carefully. I remember the sun was not so warm yet, she answered. Ethan looked up at the sky once more. The afternoon had clearly moved forward by several hours. Shadows stretched longer now across the road, and the air carried the calm stillness that often arrives before evening in quiet rural places. Ethan turned his gaze back toward the small girl sitting beside him, and the possibility he did not want to believe began forming slowly in his mind. The quiet road felt heavier now as Ethan Caldwell slowly stood from the gravel beside Lily Harper, his mind turning over the small details she had shared. The sun had clearly moved several hours across the sky, and yet the people she was waiting for had not returned. Ethan looked again down the long stretch of road that curved past the oak trees and disappeared toward the edge of the village. There were still no approaching vehicles, no distant voices, nothing except the soft rustling of leaves and the faint hum of insects in the warm air. Behind him, the driver finally stepped out of the SUV, closing the door gently so the sound would not startle the girl. Sir, the driver said quietly, walking a few steps closer. Should I check the nearby houses? Ethan kept his eyes on Lily for a moment before answering. Yes, please do. Ask if anyone knows her family. The driver nodded and began walking down the road toward the cluster of houses near the small general store. Ethan turned his attention back to the girl sitting beside the shoulder. Lily had shifted slightly, adjusting the stuffed rabbit in her arms, while tilting her head again, as if listening carefully to the world around her. "Do you hear the birds up there?" she said softly. Ethan glanced up at the branches overhead, where two small sparrows fluttered between the leaves. "Yes, I hear them." Lily smiled faintly, the kind of smile children make when they are imagining something they cannot see. "I like when they sound close," she said. "It means the trees are big." Ethan felt a quiet ache behind those words again. She had built her understanding of the world through sound and small clues rather than sight. A few minutes passed while the afternoon breeze moved gently through the road. Eventually, the driver returned his steps slower than before. Ethan looked up immediately, searching his face for an answer. The driver shook his head slightly. "Nobody nearby knows a girl named Lily Harper," he said quietly. "A couple of people said they saw a car stop earlier this morning, but they did not pay much attention." Ethan felt the weight of that information settle heavily inside his chest. He looked back at the small figure sitting patiently on the gravel, still holding her rabbit, still waiting exactly where she had been told to stay. The quiet certainty of the driver's words lingered in the warm afternoon air as Ethan Caldwell looked once more at the small girl sitting patiently on the gravel shoulder. Nobody nearby knew a girl named Lily Harper. The information settled heavily in his mind, forming a possibility he did not want to accept yet. Lily, however, remained calm, gently running her fingers across the worn fabric of her stuffed rabbit, as if time moved differently for her. The breeze brushed softly through the tall oak trees overhead and carried the distant sound of a screen door slamming somewhere far down the road. Ethan stepped closer again and lowered himself back to one knee so his voice would reach her at the same level. "Lily," he said gently, "when your parents stopped the car this morning, did they say where they were going?" The girl tilted her head slightly toward him, concentrating on the direction of his voice. "They said they needed to do something important," she answered quietly. "My dad told me to sit right here and hold my rabbit so I would not wander away." Ethan felt the words settle slowly in his chest. "Did they say how long they would be gone?" he asked. Lily thought carefully for several seconds. "No," she said. "But my mom said I am very good at waiting." Ethan looked out across the empty road again. The afternoon light had shifted toward a deeper golden color, now stretching long shadows across the gravel that reached nearly 20 feet from the oak trees. The day was moving forward, whether Lily realized it or not. A small pickup truck passed slowly at the far end of the road, the driver glancing curiously toward the black SUV but continuing on without stopping. Ethan turned back toward Lily. "Are you hungry?" he asked gently. The girl hesitated before answering. "Maybe a little," she admitted politely. Ethan stood and walked back to the SUV, opening the rear door. He retrieved a small bottle of water and a packaged snack from the console before returning to her side. "Here you go," he said softly, as he placed them carefully into her hands. Lily smiled faintly, her face brightening with simple gratitude. "Thank you, Mr. Ethan," she said. Then after a moment she asked quietly, "Do you think my parents might be lost?" The quiet question settled deeply in Ethan Caldwell's chest as Lily Harper held the small bottle of water carefully in her hands. "Do you think my parents might be lost?" Ethan did not answer immediately. He watched the little girl unscrew the cap slowly, her movements careful and practiced, as though she had learned to measure every small action without sight. She took a small sip and then held the bottle close to her chest beside the worn, stuffed rabbit. The afternoon light continued drifting lower across the road, turning the dust on the gravel into a warm, golden color. Ethan glanced again toward the long, empty stretch of road that curved between the trees. Nearly an entire day had passed since the moment Lily said her parents had stopped the car. A place like this rarely saw strangers, and yet no one in the village seemed to recognize her name. Ethan lowered himself beside her once more, resting one knee against the gravel. "Lily," he said gently. "Sometimes grown-ups run into problems that take longer than they expect." Lily nodded slowly, as if she understood the idea. "My mom always says adults get confused more than kids do," she replied softly. Ethan almost smiled at the honesty of that statement, but the heaviness inside him remained. The quiet breeze carried the faint ringing of the church bell somewhere half a mile away. It struck 4 slow notes that echoed gently through the valley. Lily's face brightened slightly when she heard it. "That is the church bell," she said. Ethan nodded, even though she could not see the motion. "Yes, it is. I told you our house is near that church." Ethan looked again toward the direction of the steeple that rose faintly above the tree line in the distance. Something about the certainty in Lily's voice made him wonder if someone there might know her family. The village was small enough that people often recognized each other even from a few words. Ethan stood slowly and brushed the dust from his pants. Lily heard the movement immediately. "Are you going somewhere, Mr. Ethan?" she asked carefully. Ethan looked down at the small girl sitting on the roadside with her rabbit resting against her arm. "I'm thinking we should try to find someone who knows you," he said gently. Lily considered that for a moment. "Do you mean the church people?" Ethan paused for a second before answering. "Yes," he said quietly. "The church people might know your family." Lily nodded with quiet trust. "That sounds like a good idea." Ethan turned toward the SUV where the driver was waiting beside the open door. But as he looked back at the empty road one more time, a strange feeling settled over him. If Lily's parents truly planned to return, they had already had more than 8 hours to do it. And the longer Ethan stood there watching that silent road, the more it felt like no one was coming back at all. The late afternoon air had begun to cool slightly. As Ethan Caldwell stood beside the quiet road, his eyes moving between the empty curve of gravel and the small girl still sitting patiently where she had been told to wait. The golden sunlight stretched long across the ground, now casting shadows that reached far beyond the tall oak trees lining the roadside. Ethan had seen enough of life to recognize when something felt wrong, and every passing minute made that feeling stronger. Lily Harper sat calmly with the bottle of water resting beside her knee and the worn, stuffed rabbit tucked carefully under her arm. She seemed unaware that nearly an entire day had slipped by since the moment her parents had driven away. Ethan stepped closer again and crouched beside her so his voice would not startle her. "Lily," he said gently, "I think we should go visit the church you mentioned. Maybe someone there will recognize your family and help us find your home." Lily turned her head toward him immediately, listening closely to the direction of his voice. "Are we walking there?" she asked. Ethan looked toward the white steeple that rose faintly above the trees about half a mile away. "It is not very far," he said, "but I have a car right here that can take us." Lily smiled faintly when she heard that. "I have never ridden in a very fancy car before," she admitted softly. Ethan almost laughed quietly at the simple honesty in her voice. "Well, today might be your first time," he replied gently. He stood and opened the rear door of the SUV before returning to help her carefully to her feet. Lily moved slowly but confidently, placing one hand lightly on Ethan's arm while holding her stuffed rabbit with the other. The moment she stood upright, she tilted her face slightly toward the breeze as if she could feel the direction of the road through the air itself. Ethan guided her the few steps to the open door and helped her settle onto the soft leather seat inside the vehicle. The driver glanced at Ethan with quiet understanding as he closed the door gently. "Church by the main road," Ethan said as he walked around to the other side and climbed into the back seat beside Lily. The SUV began rolling forward slowly, the tires crunching softly over gravel as they left the quiet roadside behind. Lily listened carefully to the sound of the engine and the movement of the car around her. "This is very smooth," she said, with quiet wonder. Ethan looked at the small girl beside him, and felt the same uneasy thought returning again. If her parents truly intended to come back for her, they would have already returned long before now. And as the SUV turned toward the white church steeple waiting in the distance, Ethan realized he might be the only person in this village who had noticed she was gone. The black SUV moved slowly along the narrow village road, the tires humming softly over the gravel, as Ethan Caldwell sat beside Lily Harper in the back seat. Through the window, Ethan watched the familiar scenery pass by: weathered wooden houses, small gardens fenced with uneven boards, and open fields stretching beyond the trees. The place looked almost exactly the same as it had 25 years ago, when he had left with nothing but a backpack and a quiet determination to escape poverty. Yet today, he was returning through it as one of the wealthiest men in the country, sitting beside a little girl who had been left alone on the roadside, with nothing but a stuffed rabbit and a promise that someone would come back. Lily sat upright in the seat, with careful posture, one hand resting lightly on the soft leather, as if she were feeling the texture of the unfamiliar car. The engine's steady sound and the gentle movement of the vehicle seemed to fascinate her. "This car feels very big," she said softly. Ethan glanced at her with a faint smile. "It is a little bigger than most cars," he admitted. Lily nodded thoughtfully, as though building a picture in her mind. "It smells nice too," she added quietly. Ethan realized she was using every other sense to understand the world around her. After a moment, she spoke again. "Are we getting close to the church?" Ethan looked ahead, where the white steeple was now clearly visible, rising above the rooftops less than a quarter-mile away. "Yes, we are almost there," he said gently. Lily smiled faintly at the news. "I like the church bell," she said. "It sounds warm when it rings." Ethan leaned back slightly against the seat, watching the approaching building. The small church stood beside a gravel parking lot with a few pickup trucks parked near the entrance. The white paint on the wooden walls had faded over the years, but the tall steeple still pointed proudly into the sky, as if protecting the quiet village around it. The SUV slowed and turned carefully into the lot. As the vehicle came to a stop, Ethan felt the same uneasy thought returning again. If Lily truly lived near this church, someone inside would surely recognize her. But if no one did, then the truth he had been avoiding would become much harder to ignore. Ethan opened the door and stepped out, the evening breeze cooler now, as the sun dipped lower toward the horizon. He walked around to help Lily from the car, gently guiding her hand to his arm. The gravel crunched beneath their feet as they began walking toward the church entrance. And for the first time since meeting her, Ethan wondered if the answers waiting inside might change both of their lives forever. The gravel beneath Ethan Caldwell's shoes shifted softly as he guided Lily Harper toward the wooden steps leading to the small white church. The evening air had grown cooler, and the golden light of the lowering sun stretched long shadows across the quiet parking lot. Lily walked carefully beside him, with one hand resting lightly on his arm and the other holding her worn, stuffed rabbit close to her chest. She moved slowly, but with quiet confidence, listening to every sound around her, as though the world spoke through small details most people never noticed. The church door stood slightly open, and the faint scent of polished wood drifted outward with the gentle breeze. As Ethan stepped inside with Lily beside him, the interior greeted them with warm amber light from tall windows along the walls. The room was simple, and peaceful rows of wooden pews, facing a small altar where a few candles flickered quietly. Somewhere deeper inside the building, a voice was humming softly, the sound echoing gently through the open space. Lily tilted her head as soon as they entered. "I can hear someone singing," she whispered. Ethan nodded even though she could not see him. "Yes, someone is here." A moment later, a middle-aged woman stepped out from a side hallway carrying a small basket of folded cloths. She paused when she saw Ethan and Lily standing near the entrance. Her expression was polite but curious, the way people in small towns often greet unexpected visitors. "Good evening," she said warmly. "Can I help you?" Ethan gave a respectful nod. "I hope so." He gently placed a hand on Lily's shoulder. "This is Lily Harper. We found her sitting alone on the road about half a mile from here earlier today. She said her home might be near this church." The woman's expression shifted slightly as she studied the small girl more carefully. Lily turned her face toward the sound of the woman's voice and gave a shy smile. "Hello, Mom," she said softly. The woman stepped closer, concern beginning to show in her eyes. "Well, hello there, sweetheart." She glanced back at Ethan with growing uncertainty. "I have lived in this village for nearly 20 years, she said slowly. "I help organize most of the community events here at the church." Ethan felt his chest tighten slightly as he waited for her next words. The woman looked at Lily again, searching her face with careful attention. "I am very sorry to say this," she continued gently, "but I do not recognize this child." Ethan felt the quiet weight of those words settle heavily in the still air of the church. And for the first time since finding Lily on that empty road, the possibility he had been avoiding began to feel impossible to ignore. The quiet inside the small church seemed to grow heavier after the woman's words settled into the air. "I do not recognize this child." Ethan Caldwell felt the meaning behind that sentence sink deeper than he wanted it to. In a village this small, people usually knew one another by name, by face, sometimes even by the sound of a familiar voice. Yet the woman standing before them looked at Lily Harper with genuine uncertainty. Lily, unaware of the weight that had just filled the room, simply held her stuffed rabbit and listened to the soft echo of their breathing within the wooden walls. Ethan gently placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder while speaking calmly to the woman. "Are there many families with children who live near this church?" he asked. The woman shook her head slowly. "Not many anymore. Most young families moved closer to the larger towns years ago." She paused, studying Lily again with a softer expression. "Sweetheart," she said kindly, "do you remember the name of your street or maybe the color of your house?" Lily tilted her head slightly, thinking carefully. "I remember a porch that creaks when someone walks on it," she answered quietly. "And my mom has wind chimes that sound like tiny bells when the wind blows." The woman exchanged a concerned glance with Ethan. Those small details described half the homes in the village. Ethan looked down at Lily, choosing his next words carefully. "Lily, when your parents stopped the car earlier today, what kind of car were they driving?" Lily thought for several seconds. "I think it was light-colored," she said slowly. "Maybe silver or white." Ethan felt the uneasy feeling in his chest deepen. Cars had come and gone through the village all day, and without a clear description, there would be no easy way to track it. The woman folded her arms gently as worry crept into her voice. "If this little girl was left on the roadside this morning, someone should have reported it already." Ethan nodded quietly, but the thought forming in his mind was darker than the words she had spoken. Outside the church windows, the evening sun had begun dipping toward the horizon, casting long orange light through the glass panes and across the wooden floor. Lily turned her face toward the warmth of the sunlight filtering through the window. "It feels like sunset," she said softly. Ethan swallowed slowly, realizing something that made his chest tighten. Lily had waited nearly an entire day, exactly where she had been told. And now, standing inside that quiet church, the possibility was no longer distant. The people she was waiting for might never have planned to return at all. The warm orange glow of sunset continued spilling through the tall church windows, stretching long bands of light across the wooden floor as silence lingered between Ethan Caldwell, the woman from the church, and the small girl standing quietly beside him. Lily Harper held her stuffed rabbit gently against her chest, unaware that the quiet room around her had become filled with a truth no one wanted to speak aloud yet. Ethan slowly exhaled and stepped slightly closer to the woman so his voice would remain calm for Lily's sake. "Is there anyone else in the village who might recognize her?" he asked quietly. The woman hesitated, clearly thinking through the small number of families who still lived nearby. "A few elderly couples," she said slowly, "and one family with 2 boys near the edge of town. But I have never seen this little girl before today." She glanced again toward Lily with growing sadness. In a place this small, a child like her would not go unnoticed. Ethan nodded, the weight in his chest, growing heavier with every passing moment. Lily turned her face slightly, as if listening to the subtle shift in their voices. "Mr. Ethan," she said softly, "are we going to find my house soon?" Ethan crouched gently so he could speak at her level. "We are still trying to figure that out," he replied carefully. Lily seemed to consider his answer before asking another question in her small, patient voice. "Do you think my parents got very lost?" The innocence behind the words made Ethan pause. He chose his response slowly. "Sometimes adults make choices that children cannot understand right away," he said gently. Lily hugged the rabbit closer to her chest, thinking quietly about that idea. The woman from the church looked away briefly, clearly struggling with the same thought that had begun forming in Ethan's mind. Outside, the final light of the sun dipped lower toward the distant hills, and the first faint sounds of evening insects began filling the quiet village air. Ethan stood again, looking through the church window toward the fading road that led back toward the place where he had found Lily sitting alone. Nearly 10 hours had passed since she had been left there. 10 hours of waiting exactly where she had been told, trusting completely that someone would return. The longer Ethan stood there thinking about it, the more certain he became of something that made his chest tighten with anger and sadness at the same time. Lily had not been forgotten. She had been left there on purpose. The last light of the sun faded slowly behind the hills beyond the village, leaving the inside of the church wrapped in a softer evening glow. The tall windows now reflected deep shades of orange and purple as the quiet hum of insects outside began to replace the sounds of the afternoon. Ethan Caldwell stood near the center aisle, his eyes drifting toward the doorway that led back out to the empty road, where he had first seen Lily Harper sitting alone. The realization had settled firmly in his chest, now heavy and undeniable. The people she had been waiting for were not simply delayed. They had chosen not to come back. Lily stood beside him, still holding her stuffed rabbit, her small fingers brushing its worn fabric as if the familiar texture helped her feel safe in a world she could not see. She turned her face slightly toward Ethan's voice even before he spoke. "Mr. Ethan," she asked quietly, "do you think my parents are still looking for me?" The question moved through the quiet church like a fragile piece of glass. The woman standing near the front pew lowered her eyes, unable to answer it herself. Ethan felt the weight of the moment pressing against him. He knelt slowly so that his voice would meet Lily at the same level, his tone calm but steady. "Lily," he said gently, "sometimes the world gives us moments that change our lives in ways we do not expect." Lily listened carefully, her expression thoughtful but patient. "I am very good at waiting," she said softly. "My mom always told me that." Ethan felt something tighten inside his chest at those words. He knew that if he allowed her to return to that roadside with the same belief, she would sit there again for hours, maybe even days, trusting a promise that had already been broken. He placed one reassuring hand lightly on her shoulder. "You do not have to wait there anymore," he said quietly. Lily tilted her head, slightly surprised by the certainty in his voice. "I do not." Ethan shook his head gently, even though she could not see the motion. "No, you do not." The churchwoman looked up, sensing something changing in the room. Ethan stood slowly and glanced toward the darkening sky beyond the windows. For most of his life, he had built companies, signed contracts, and made decisions that affected thousands of employees across the country. But none of those decisions had ever felt as personal as the one forming in his mind now. He turned back toward Lily and spoke in a calm, steady voice that carried a promise stronger than the one she had been given earlier that morning. "Lily Harper, from this moment on, you are not alone anymore. I am not leaving you behind." The quiet promise lingered in the air of the small church as evening slowly settled over the village outside. Ethan Caldwell remained kneeling beside Lily Harper for a moment longer, allowing his words to rest gently in her mind. Lily stood still with her stuffed rabbit held against her chest. Her small face turned slightly toward him, as if she were listening not only to his voice but to the meaning behind it. "You are not leaving me behind," she repeated softly, as though testing the sentence to see if it felt real. Ethan gave a calm nod, even though she could not see the motion. "No, Lily," he said gently. "You will not be alone tonight." The woman from the church stepped a little closer, concern still visible on her face, but now mixed with relief that the little girl was no longer standing in uncertainty. "That is very kind of you," she said quietly to Ethan. "What will you do next?" Ethan stood slowly, his mind already moving through the practical steps that had to follow. "The first thing we need is a safe place for Lily tonight," he said. "Somewhere warm where she can rest." The woman nodded. "The church has a small guest room near the back hallway. We sometimes let travelers stay there when storms pass through the valley." Ethan glanced down at Lily. "Would you like to stay somewhere warm tonight where there is a bed and blankets?" he asked softly. Lily's face brightened slightly at the idea. "That sounds nice," she admitted quietly. The day had clearly been long for her, even though she had waited through most of it with patient calm. Ethan turned briefly toward his driver, who had remained respectfully near the entrance of the church. "Please call the office in Boston," Ethan said. "Tell them I will need a few days here." The driver nodded immediately, already reaching for his phone. Ethan then looked back toward the churchwoman. "Tomorrow morning I will contact the local authorities and child services so they can begin looking for her family." Lily listened carefully as the adults spoke around her, her fingers gently tracing the seam of the stuffed rabbit's ear. "Mr. Ethan," she said after a moment. Ethan looked down at her again. "Yes, Lily. Will you still be here in the morning?" Ethan did not hesitate this time. "Yes," he answered calmly. "I will still be here." Lily gave a small content nod as if that answer settled everything she needed to know. Outside the church windows, the last light of evening faded completely, and for the first time since that morning on the roadside, Lily Harper was no longer waiting alone. Morning arrived quietly over the small village as soft sunlight spread across the church windows and filled the guest room where Lily Harper had spent the night. The room was simple but warm, with a wooden bed, a small dresser, and curtains that moved gently with the early breeze. Lily sat on the edge of the bed, holding her stuffed rabbit, while listening to the sounds of the morning outside. Birds moved between the trees near the churchyard, and somewhere nearby a truck engine started before fading down the road. The smell of coffee drifted faintly through the hallway. A moment later, there was a soft knock on the door. Lily tilted her head immediately toward the sound. "Come in," she said politely. The door opened and Ethan Caldwell stepped inside carrying a small paper bag from the village bakery. "Good morning, Lily," he said in a calm voice. Lily's face brightened when she recognized him. "Good morning, Mr. Ethan." "You stayed," she said softly. Ethan smiled slightly. "I told you I would." He walked over and placed the bag gently on the small table beside the bed. "I brought you breakfast. Fresh muffins and some orange juice." Lily reached carefully toward the table until her fingers touched the paper bag. "It smells very good," she said happily. While she began eating, Ethan stepped to the window and looked out over the quiet village road. Early sunlight stretched across the churchyard, and the same oak trees stood along the distant roadside where he had first found Lily waiting the day before. The memory of that moment still lingered clearly in his mind. After Lily finished a few bites, she spoke again. "Mr. Ethan, what happens today?" Ethan turned back toward her. "Today we are going to make sure you are safe and that people know you are here," he explained gently. "I have already spoken with the local sheriff and someone from Child Services is driving here this morning to help us figure out the next steps." Lily nodded slowly, listening carefully to every word. "Will they find my parents?" she asked quietly. Ethan paused before answering. "They will try to find out what happened," he said calmly. Lily hugged her stuffed rabbit again, but did not look afraid. "As long as you are here too," she said softly. Ethan felt something shift quietly inside his chest at those words. For years, his life had been built around business deals, flights between cities and meetings that filled entire calendars. Yet standing inside that small guest room in a village he once escaped, he realized something unexpected. For the first time in a very long while, his presence truly mattered to someone. Later that morning, the quiet village road outside the church filled briefly with the low sound of an approaching vehicle as a white county sedan rolled slowly into the gravel parking lot. The door opened, and a woman stepped out carrying a small folder under her arm. She introduced herself as Rebecca Lawson from County Child Services, her voice calm and professional but kind. Ethan Caldwell stood beside Lily Harper near the church entrance as Rebecca greeted them. Lily held Ethan's hand lightly while her other arm hugged the worn stuffed rabbit against her chest. The woman knelt gently so her voice would be closer to Lily's level. "Hello, Lily. My name is Rebecca. I am here to help make sure you are safe." Lily turned her face toward the voice with quiet curiosity. "Hello, Miss Rebecca," she said politely. Rebecca smiled softly and then stood to speak with Ethan and the church volunteer nearby. She asked several careful questions about where Lily had been found, what time of day it was, and whether anyone in the village recognized her family. Ethan explained everything, clearly describing the long hours Lily had spent waiting on the roadside and the unsuccessful search through the nearby homes. Rebecca listened carefully while writing notes inside her folder. After a moment, she closed it and looked at Ethan with a thoughtful expression. "The first step will be a formal report and a search for the parents through surrounding counties," she explained. "But for now, the most important thing is that Lily remains somewhere safe and stable." Ethan nodded slowly. "She can stay here at the church for now if needed." Rebecca glanced down at Lily, who was quietly tracing the stitching along her stuffed rabbit while listening to the adults speak. Then Rebecca looked back at Ethan. "I was also informed that you offered to assist with her care temporarily," she said. Ethan did not hesitate. "Yes, I did." Rebecca studied him for a moment, recognizing his name from news articles and business headlines she had seen many times before. "It is not often that someone with your responsibilities decides to remain personally involved in a situation like this," she said carefully. Ethan looked down at Lily standing beside him. "Some moments matter more than schedules," he replied calmly. Rebecca nodded with quiet respect. "In that case, we will arrange temporary guardianship paperwork while the investigation continues." Lily lifted her face slightly when she heard that word. "Guardianship," she repeated softly. Ethan knelt beside her again so his voice stayed steady and reassuring. "It means I will help take care of you while we figure everything out," he explained gently. Lily thought about that for a moment before smiling faintly. "That sounds like a very good plan." Over the next several days, the quiet village slowly became aware that something unusual had happened. The story spread in small conversations at the general store near the church steps and along the same dusty road where Lily Harper had once waited alone. People began noticing the black SUV parked near the church more often, and the man who stepped out of it each morning was someone many of them suddenly recognized from television and newspapers. Ethan Caldwell had returned to the village where he once grew up poor, but this time he was spending his days walking beside a small blind girl who held a stuffed rabbit and listened carefully to the world around her. During the following week, Rebecca Lawson completed the necessary paperwork that allowed Ethan to care for Lily while the search for her parents continued. The investigation spread across several counties, but no one came forward, and no missing person report matched Lily's name. While officials continued their work, Ethan quietly began arranging something else. One afternoon, he guided Lily across the churchyard grass and toward the oak trees near the roadside where he had first seen her sitting. The wind moved gently through the leaves above them, and the familiar sound made Lily smile faintly. "The birds are still here," she said softly. "Yes, they are," Ethan replied. He paused for a moment before speaking again. Lily, I would like to help you visit a special doctor in Boston, someone who works with children who cannot see well. Lily tilted her head with curiosity. Do you think they can fix my eyes? Ethan did not promise something he could not guarantee, but his voice remained warm and steady. They will do everything they can to help you see the world more clearly. Lily hugged her stuffed rabbit and smiled toward the sound of his voice. That would be very nice. And as Ethan stood beneath those same oak trees where their paths first crossed, he realized the decision he made that day had quietly begun changing both of their lives. Several weeks later, the quiet village gathered once again near the small white church. But this time, the mood felt different. Word had spread that Ethan Caldwell was preparing to leave for Boston, and many of the villagers had come to say goodbye to the little girl who had quickly become known throughout the community. Lily Harper stood beside Ethan near the church steps, holding her familiar stuffed rabbit, while the soft autumn breeze moved gently through the trees around them. She had spent the past days learning the sounds of the village, the creak of the church porch, the distant rumble of trucks passing along the county road, and the cheerful voices of neighbors who had slowly begun treating her like family. Rebecca Lawson had completed the final temporary guardianship approval, allowing Ethan to take Lily with him while specialists in Boston evaluated her eyesight. Lily tilted her head slightly toward the wind as the church bell rang once in the afternoon air. I think I will remember that sound forever, she said softly. Ethan smiled faintly beside her. The bell will still be here whenever you visit again, he replied. The black SUV waited quietly near the gravel road where their story had begun, its engine silent, as villagers stood nearby offering kind words and small waves of farewell. Lily carefully reached for Ethan's hand before they walked toward the car. Mr. Ethan, she said thoughtfully, when we get to Boston, will the city sound very different? Ethan glanced down at her with warmth in his voice. Yes, it will be louder and faster than this village, but you will learn its sounds just like you learned this place. Lily smiled gently and hugged her stuffed rabbit. As long as you are there too, she said softly. Ethan opened the car door for her and helped her inside, and as the vehicle slowly rolled away from the churchyard, the same quiet road that once held a lonely child waiting alone now carried the beginning of an entirely new future. Months later, winter snow lightly covered the same quiet village road where everything had first begun. The oak trees stood bare now, their branches reaching into a pale sky, while soft wind moved across the empty gravel shoulder. For the people who lived nearby, the story of the little girl who had once waited there alone had slowly become something they told visitors with a mixture of sadness and pride. But far away in Boston, Lily Harper stood inside a bright hospital hallway, holding Ethan Caldwell's hand, while a doctor finished adjusting a small pair of special glasses designed to help strengthen what vision she had. The process had taken time and patience, but the specialists believed Lily's eyesight could gradually improve with treatment and therapy. Lily turned her face toward Ethan, her expression filled with cautious excitement. I can see shapes better now, she said softly. The light looks different. Ethan smiled warmly beside her. That is a very good start, he replied. Lily squeezed his hand gently before asking the question that had been quietly growing in her heart for weeks. Mr. Ethan, she said slowly, when people stay together for a long time and take care of each other, does that mean they become a family? Ethan felt the simple question settle deeply inside him. He looked down at the little girl who had once been waiting alone beside a dusty road with nothing but a stuffed rabbit and a promise that no one had kept. His answer came without hesitation. Yes, Lily, sometimes that is exactly how a family begins. Lily smiled in the direction of his voice, the warmth of the moment brighter than the winter sunlight outside the hospital windows. And somewhere far away in the quiet village where their story began, the empty roadside where she once waited was no longer a place of abandonment. It had become the place where two lives had quietly found each other and started a new future together. Did this story move your soul? Share your feelings in the comments and rate it from 1 to 10. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, then tap the bell icon so you never miss a new story. Click the end screen to watch another heartfelt video. See you in the next story.